Okay, good day, ladies and gentlemen. Delighted that you can join us on our third joint webinar between APMG and Wappp. The topic is very topical, PPP and COVID-19. Because of the amount of information that we want to be able to discuss, we have extended the time or the potential duration of this webinar to 1.5 hours. So we may not need all that time, but the webinar could remain open until 2:30. I hope everyone can stay on for the duration rather than have to chop off after 1 hour. Sorry about the short notice. Next slide. Next. Alicia. Thank you. Right, before we get started, just a bit of housekeeping. The session is being recorded and the slides will be sent to you after the webinar along with the recording. All participants are muted, only the speakers can open their microphones. So please type any questions into the questions window. And these will be relayed to Naresh, the moderator of the questions session, toward the end of this session for the panelists to answer. And any feedback to improve the webinar, an address there, if you could send it to Alicia, please. Next. The agenda is fairly straightforward, comprises two parts. The first part is the impact of COVID-19, how to deal with repercussions and lessons learnt. Part two is the impact on training and examinations for the certification program and mitigation measures. The third part is a question and answer session where the panel will be answering your questions. Next. Next, please. Yeah, the panel, these distinguished gentlemen and ladies, David Baxter, Mark Frillet, Natalia Koshakova-Heeb, and Thibaut Morg are the main panelists. Naresh Bana will be moderating the question and answer session. I will introduce each of these people at the beginning of their presentation. I'll introduce them properly. Next, please. Right, part one, you've seen this before effectively. Impact of COVID-19 pandemic on PPP projects and programs, how to deal with its repercussions and what lessons can be learnt and opportunities that come out of it. Next, please. Next. Thank you. Let me now introduce David Baxter. David is an independent PPP consultant who has advised on public and private sector institutions all over the world on sustainable and resilient implementation of PPPs. He is a steering committee member of Wappp and a senior advisor to the International Sustainable Resilience Centre. He is a collaborator with the UNICE PPP Centre of Excellence in Geneva. He also contributed to this APMG's core PPP curriculum and the certification tests. David will be talking about pragmatic measures to keep PPPs operating during the COVID-19 outbreak and future black swan events, strategic approaches to recovery in the short, medium and long term, and the need for future forward-looking sustainability and resiliency considerations. Next, please. Next. So, David, over to you.
Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. The COVID-19 event was totally unexpected and governments were unprepared for this. And as a result, we found that governments are stumbling around trying to make headway. And unfortunately, it seems that many cases that bureaucratic red tape is getting in the way. We can't allow PPP projects to fail. That's an absolute focus that should be out there, because every time a project fails, to restart it is going to be a nightmare. So what is happening, or what is needed, is the participants or the stakeholders are going to have to look at cumulative ways to leverage the resources of both the public and the private sector to augment recovery efforts. We need to look at economic activity and PPP projects, because they're going to be experiencing considerable losses of revenue in the coming weeks, months, and possible years. And no one is sure how long the COVID-19 will last. But governments are going to have declining revenues. The private sector is going to have declining revenues as well. And as a result, we're going to have to be innovative. Next one.
Alicia, next. Next slide.
So what I'm calling for is a pragmatic recovery. And this is where both parties are facing the challenge seriously, and they understand that each party should be given guarantees as soon as challenges or problems arise, that if they bring it up, they will not face punitive actions. There's a situation in many contracts where it seems that if something goes wrong, one party will step back and say it's not their problem, the other party needs to sort it out. But because of the magnitude of COVID-19, this is impossible. So what's going to happen is they're going to have to be recovery plans for PPPs that are harmonized with national strategic priorities, and we will have to look at short, medium, and long-term strategy goals. The short-term ones are the absolute focus on keeping projects moving forward currently. This will set the foundation for the medium and long-term focus, where there will be a need to look at what can be done to keep projects moving forward after a year, and the projects that are in the pipeline, whether they are needed, whether they should be reorganized. And then also we should be looking at all projects and deciding whether we need to change conditions in the contracts, etc., to ensure that the backlog in activity is caught up with and projects will survive. And it's also important that we do identify project vulnerabilities, and this means an honest assessment. And the decisions that need to be made cannot be made in a vacuum. All stakeholders need to be involved. Next. Next slide. So there are some specific actions that can be considered, and I think one of the important ones is that we need to avoid penalizing underperformance in the short term. If you are focused on PPP recovery, it makes no sense to penalize the companies if they are not performing, because it's no one's fault. There are ways also to look at unselfish collaboration, where you look for the common good of projects, and you're also focused on win-win strategies. This is going to be extremely important. The planning and design of future PPPs is also going to require a considerable rethink, revisioning, revisiting, and I think it's really important that as we look at future projects that we focus on sustainability and resilience. And then there's a new element that's being introduced to PPP practices around the world, and that's the idea of people first PPPs. The coronavirus has taught us that people count more or as much as economic considerations, and these will have to be considered as well and be built into the terms of conditions and best practices for PPs in the future. Next. So there are some specific actions we can consider. For example, PPP projects under construction or underway, we'll definitely need to explore the impact of labor shortages and supply breakdowns. This is a force majeure event of magnitude, as I said, that no one could expect. And with the world economy shut down and everyone siloed, I'm not quite sure who's to blame. We shouldn't be pointing fingers at who's to blame, but we should be trying to find ways to ensure that labor shortages do not occur because of government mandated quarantines, and also that supply chains don't break down because of the breakdown of international trade. We need to revisit construction timelines, look at what can be done now, and then maybe push off projects and put them into a phase of standstill for a few months until they have a chance to catch up. One element that's really important is we need to focus also on the small contractors who definitely in most cases do not have the liquidity to survive the pandemic and might not have been even covered by force majeure insurance. Exploring the recovery steps is critically important, but at all times we need to explore health and safety concerns concerned with the stalled projects and their impacts on surrounding communities. Next one.
There's 2 minutes to go.
Okay. Specific actions I think that we can consider in the operation and maintenance area is, determine the impact on a limited operation scope caused by the activities. There are operational expenses that could be prioritized. We can cut costs while still keeping essential employees engaged. I think also that it's important that essential infrastructure is not downgraded, and that an operation and management project reactivation plan is put in place. But this is a wonderful opportunity for organizations to consider the maintenance of projects and keep, maybe catch up with maintenance, deferred maintenance activities, so that when projects are relaunched, they are in a fantastic position to be able to move forward. Next one. So just some concluding thoughts. It's impossible to have a detailed list of actions that can be taking place because everything is changing, everything is fluid. Once we thought we've beaten one monster, then another one pops up its head. But I think it's important that governments, when it comes to PPPs, need to actively engage with their private sector partners to leverage both groups' resources. It is also important that the private sector be given assurances that they are still valued partners and that we can move forward with them. Recovery plans need to be harmonized. Voluntary and mandatory measures for recovery should be explored with the private sector, and then decisions should be made that include all stakeholders, and maybe not just the project team or the project company or the public and private sector partners, but also the users outside. Again, I'd like to emphasize we cannot allow PPP projects to fail. To restart them would take too much time. What is really important is that we are pragmatic, solution seekers, not punitive. We look for opportunities to maybe even bend the rules of the contracts at times if it will ensure the safety of the project. But the bottom line is PPPs cannot fail.
Next, please, Alicia. Well, thank you, David, for that very interesting presentation. We turn now to Mark Frillet. For 35 years, Mark has focused his efforts on complex construction, infrastructure, concessions, PPPs, mining projects in France, in France and in 20 developing nations, most of them in Africa. He has more than 100 publications to his name and is a frequent speaker at conferences, seminars, and capacity building programs around the world. He is head of the UNICE International Center of Excellence in PPP policies, laws, and institutions, and he has contributed to develop the concept of People First PPPs. Mark will speak about how to qualify the COVID-19 pandemic for existing PPP contracts, what lessons can be learned, what are the best practices from which deserve to be debated and to be usefully considered, and more broadly for resilient PPPs in public services. Next, Mark, it's over to you.
Thank you. So from a legal standpoint, on existing contracts, it's quite clear that currently, if you look around the world, there are 3 qualification options. The first one being force majeure, which is an event which is beyond the control of the parties, which prevents to fulfill a material portion of the contract. The second one will be hardship, which is a contract which is more onerous, but not impossible to perform. And the third one will be fait du prince, in other terms, material adverse government actions. And all those three are general possibility to find relief in different jurisdictions. So then I will go a little bit further next on force majeure. Next. So force majeure is widely recognized internationally, even if words are differently used, but it is a situation where you have at the same time an unforeseeable event, an irresistible impossibility to perform the obligation, but only the obligation which is impacted directly by the event in that particular situation by COVID. It is an excuse for non-performance of the obligation which is impossible, but no more. Because aside from that, each party bears all other economic and legal consequences. As we say, the loss lies where it falls. And in most cases, especially in PPP, the contract is not terminated unless the subject matter is destroyed or after a long time period. Next. Next, please. Hardship. Hardship is something which is recognized only by some jurisdictions, but more and more widely recognized internationally. For instance, the Unidroit principle, which provides for regulating in the same manner the law around the world, provide for hardship. What is essential in hardship is that we need to have an unforeseeable changes of economic circumstances which go beyond a certain threshold. Performance is not impossible, but excessively onerous. In this situation, if you have in some jurisdiction or with adequate contractual clauses, there is a right to reinstate up to a certain level the economic balance of the contract. And by definition, this will be a much better remedy than force majeure because the contract goes back to its economic basis. Contract is not terminated unless specific clause. Next. Next, please. Fait du prince, otherwise said in English word, material adverse government actions. So this, you need to distinguish two things there from a legal standpoint. One which is very general, which apply indistinctly to everyone. In that situation, we are very close to force majeure, so it's not a very good remedy unless you have a good clause. The other one is more specific. It is an action which directly comes from the contracting party. In that case, depending on the level of priority of the contract, you have another action, which is, hey, guys, you have been in default, and I have the right to be indemnified. So those are the three principles. Next, please. Now, next, please. Now, what is the impact of COVID on PPP contract? It's important to remember, and that was very well said before by David, that PPP have several distinctive features from normal contract. They are public contract. They are designed to be on a public interest, and that is very different from one-to-one interest. You have one private person and the other public party all together working on behalf of often thousands or 10,000 of people. They are very long-term contract based on outcome. And what is very important to notice in most cases, in good PPP, the duration is linked to an economic and financial scenario which permit to recover all investment and costs and includes the profit element. PPP contribute directly to a public service, and then COVID is only a temporary event in relation to PPP. It doesn't affect the physical possibility to reinstate the service when health condition permits. So then in practice, what happened? Disruption of the service for COVID should not entail termination. 2, the private partner is clearly excused for not performing its obligation impacted by COVID, but it has a duty to mitigate. Now, if the impact of COVID destroys the economic balance of the contract, it is equitable, and that is more and more agreed around the world, to reinstate the initial economic equilibrium within limits. So then, next slide, please. What is the practical approach? Then, 2 ways. if you don't have a set of clauses which provide sufficient relief, you have no choice than to enter into a renegotiation. What is important to understand for PPP, in most cases, it is very difficult to get a direct monetary compensation. It is often a problem for the contracting authority, short of cash. But PPP is specific due to long terms and the future type of the service. Focus on a renegotiation of key clauses, such as contract duration, tax relief, change of scope of the service, fitting clause to the public authority, etc. Now the question is then how to organize a good approach to renegotiation. Which reference? What is the current situation? What could be the future situation? It is there that it is worth to consider some best practice for resilient PPP, for sustainable PPP, which have been mostly developed for the concession PPP world, where those issues of event of the type of COVID for public service have been often encountered. Now, the practice has developed a set of modern clauses which entail what we call regulation by contract, not by the outside regulator, not for negotiation, but the clause together relates to what? It relates to an agreed financial and economic scenario that both parties are looking at on a permanent basis for checking that the project remains within the financial and economic viability which was at the origin of the agreement. So this scenario is then updated and used as a key reference and can be used as a key reference for maintaining the economic viability that exists currently in many concession PPP, modern concession PPP. Now, what is the rationale for that? Is to give effect to a fundamental principle of contract, which is that your contractual relationship and obligation remain valid, provided that the thing remains as they are, that rebus ex sentibus, and also that will facilitate the continuation of the project since PPP cannot fail. Now, where to find some reference to what I'm just saying? You can find that in a list of clauses and guiding principles for concession PPP, which have been published under the UNICE International Center of Excellence project. Thank you.
Next slide, please. Thank you, Mark. Let me introduce Natalia Kolchakova-Heeb. Natalia is an internationally recognized expert in sustainable infrastructure, public procurement, private-public partnerships, and international technical assistance, with experience in the public, private, and non-governmental sectors. She is PPP speaker of the German Health Alliance and the coordinator of the working group on partnerships within Global Health Hub Germany. Natalia will present some recent PPP case studies relating how various public and private entities have teamed up to contribute to combating COVID-19 pandemic. Next is over to Natalia.
Good afternoon, everyone. Happy to be on this panel. COVID-19 is a major event that exposes the lack of preparedness and resilience of the increasingly globalized and interconnected world. And it certainly won't be the last pandemic. Spreads of new widely viruses were occurring every year. SARS, MERS, Ebola, Zika virus, just to mention a few. But the world will never be the same again after this crisis. And COVID-19 will trigger a lot of rethinking of how health systems should work. How to respond to COVID-19 pandemic, and to get prepared for the next one too, as Bill Gates provocatively said another day. Let's have a look how the public-private actors can work together during this difficult time. Next slide, please. Thank you. Our problem is that we are building an airplane while flying it. Governments and policymakers are not able to cope alone with COVID-19. The challenge is too big, and they are currently in search for immediate innovative solutions to close the gap in delivery of healthcare infrastructure, to track the spread of the virus, to ensure patients get care that they need. And development of vaccines, tests, and treatments is accelerated. COVID-19 pandemic started as a public health emergency and has quickly developed into economic and social crisis. We are facing a crisis that requires swift and smart solutions, and also agility in dealing with. It creates new opportunities for the private sector to work alongside public sector and to share expertise and resources. Next slide, please. Thank you. Our solution is public-private partnerships. PPPs could be very instrumental in responding to COVID-19. They offer innovations, extra resources otherwise not available, that is critical in the emergency situation. PPPs in the health sector have evolved over the last decades to go beyond infrastructure and include also service delivery, project delivery, and product development. In current situation of COVID-19, where expertise is particularly thin, private companies, NGOs, academia will be particularly important partners helping to anticipate potential remedies. Multi-stakeholder approaches become increasingly necessary. PPPs against Corona is a new hashtag to promote PPPs as an instrument to combat COVID-19. Let's have a closer look at some cases around the world. Next slide, please. Thank you. Australia announced a healthcare PPP to fight Corona and to secure 30,000 hospital beds and more than 100,000 staff available. The federal government will offer agreements to more than 600 private and non-for-profit hospitals to ensure their viability. The question could be now, how to tender a PPP project in such a short time? This would imply that a certain homework should be done beforehand. The private companies should be pre-qualified and certain simplified procurement procedures are in place. For instance, European Commission has published earlier this month guidance on using the public procurement framework in the emergency situation related to COVID-19 crisis. Firstly, in case of urgency, public authorities allowed to substantially reduce the deadlines to accelerate open or restricted procedures. Secondly, should those flexibilities not be sufficient, a negotiated procedure without publication could be envisaged. Eventually, even a direct award to a pre-selected economic operator could be allowed, provided this is the only way to deliver required supplies within technical and time constraints. Public buyers may negotiate directly with potential contractors, and there are no publication requirements, no time limits, no minimum number of candidates to be consulted, no other procedural requirements required. Next slide, please. India. The Ministry of Electronics and IT launched a new app built through public-private partnership, which help people in India to identify the risk of being infected by the coronavirus. This app was a success. It had 5 million downloads within just 3 days of its launch, making it one of the most popular governmental apps in India. It is the world's fastest growing mobile application with more than 50 million installs. Next slide, please. EU is backing new 90 million public-private partnership to develop a vaccine against COVID-19. And I would like to say that this approach, this PPP approach, is not new to the European Union. Another example is the European Lead Factory, which is the public-private partnership that aims to accelerate early drug discovery in Europe. The European Lead Factory is a pan-European consortium that includes 7 pharma companies, academia, and SMEs. Next slide, please. Another super interesting and innovative example is from the United States. The US government, academia, and industry struck a public-private partnership called COVID-19 High Performance Computing Consortium to allow researchers tackling COVID-19 and to access the high-performance computing resources. Members of consortium include IBM, Amazon, Google, and national government. Next slide, please. Thank you. Germany. The global pandemic like COVID-19 demonstrated that more coordination and mobilization of networks is required. PPP Health for All, a platform about PPPs in the healthcare sector, strives to connect all PPP stakeholders in one ecosystem and to identify innovative PPP solutions in fighting coronavirus. Please share your projects or some good examples you might be aware of. Remember, sharing is caring. And by sharing your projects, you help identify innovative PPP solutions and approaches. Next slide, please. What are the conclusions? In the quest to combat COVID-19, we must recognize that there is no universally applicable solution. Each country has a unique path and strives to design its own strategies that include private sector. But we could use this momentum to change our approach from reactive to being proactive, to innovate about public-private partnerships and make them serve the purpose. Thank you, and happy to answer your questions later on.
Can we have the next slide, please? Thank you, Natalia. Right, our next panelist is Thibaut Morg. He is a founding partner of 4IP and lead capital raising and catalyzing. He specializes in PPPs with people first, impact investing, and green finance dimensions. Thibaut is a former banker and a financial sector and project finance specialist with about 30 years experience in the development of private and public investment projects, as well as PPP, PFI structures for large infrastructure projects and corporate investment projects in various industries. Thibaut will speak about the impact on COVID on PPP planning and how to deal with the short-term disruption and liquidity, the medium-term inflation and reduction of fiscal space, and the long-term emergence of new economic models, new international regulations, and renewed priorities. PPPs shall remain on the agenda, but governments will need to put in place more emphasis on sustainability and the Sustainability Development Goals. Next slide, please. Thibaut, it's over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. I think we all agree that the current crisis is not only a short-term sanitary shock, but it's also a pivotal moment at the financial, the economic, the social, the political, even the geopolitical level. So it will have a huge impact on PPPs. And government will have to be ready and get prepared for that. So planning is at the agenda. And PPP policy responses will need to be at the same time adaptive, mostly in the short term, reactive, mostly in the medium term, and proactive in the long term, maybe a little bit of all this together. Next. So what do we see around us at the moment? We see disruption for supply chain, lockdown, bankruptcies looming. Maybe we've only seen the beginning, but the next months could be very harsh. We see a liquidity crisis, even for very large company. You saw that, for instance, the French government had to recapitalize Air France for 7 billion euros. So this liquidity crisis can be mitigated with government money, but it remains to be seen how this money will go through the financial sector to reach the companies that really need them. The banks will, of course, in this context, stay very cautious. So we'll have a credit crunch, except for state-guaranteed loans. Investors, of course, will also be very cautious and will minimize the equity risk. Next. So what can government do for existing contracts? It has already been discussed by other speakers. Review the clause of the contract, but it's more than a legal review that is needed. It's a real dialogue to anticipate and solve on common agreement basis all issues that will arise. For ongoing tenders, the keyword is flexibility, digitalization, deadline extension. It's also possible that some bidders may risk bankruptcy. So this is something that governments need to investigate. And for the scheduled tenders, government will have to consider whether postponement or cancellation are adequate. Also, mega projects may be more at risk because it will be more difficult for them to reach financial close. Next. In the medium term, that is next year, we'll see a huge financial crisis. Debt level will reach worrying levels. We know that Italy's debt to GDP ratio will be over 150%. Is this sustainable? For developing countries, there will be need for debt relief. G20 has already started this, but more decisive actions are necessary. And we can expect inflation in the coming years. This financial crisis will move into an economic crisis, and especially concession projects will be at risk because of the loss in traffic and less consumers that will be able to afford the tariffs. And this economic crisis may turn into a political crisis. In developing countries, maybe poverty riots, governments will be under strong pressure, but also in the Eurozone, if Spain and Italy are not able to refinance debt, the question of euro will be put on the table. Next. So in this context, government will have to pay very close attention to fiscal sustainability issues, to limit as much as possible liabilities, limit guarantees for the new projects, and they will have to insist that the financial structuring become more robust with less leverage. The second idea is to use PPPs as far as possible as a stimulus for the recovery. So to prioritize projects that can start immediately. We know there are a lot of limitations on this because PPP projects take a very long time to mature, but the government needs to review the schedule. This is also true for the prioritization criteria. The key should be contribution to long-term growth and to abandon projects that are only for prestige or so-called modernization. And one particular attention should be paid to the poor because they are the most vulnerable. And here comes the concept of people first PPPs that should be implemented by governments. Next. So what will happen in the longer term? It's a bit difficult, of course, because uncertainty is so large. But we probably see new economic models, more virtuous. We'll see growing financial involvement of the private sector alongside the strategic role of government, which will increase. We probably see more emphasis on national autonomy, meaning relocation from Asia to Europe and US, with implication on the logistic chain. And also a big question mark on the energy transition. If oil prices remain low, it will be more difficult to achieve the target without price incitations. Next. Next one.
Is there?
Yeah, next one. Okay. So government will have to work on the project assessment criteria, such as the work that is being developed with the support of Wappp, also by UNEC on people first PPPs. In any case, resiliency should be a major component in the planning, as mentioned already by David. And this will necessarily have an impact on sector allocation. Of course, airport projects will probably be postponed to distant future, but telecom and health will take more precedence. Overall, government will have to think of a more balanced global development model. Next. Final slide is coming. Yeah, so to conclude with, in a nutshell, of course, we'll need to adjust continuously as the situation will evolve. But I believe that PPPs is the right tool because the future will be a more risky world, and PPPs is all about risk management, risk transfer, risk mitigation. So we'll have to keep working with PPPs. In a context where developing countries will be fragilized, so they will need more support, either from bilateral institutions such as DFIs, if you want to maintain a minimum stability of the global arena. So at least I am convinced that PPP is more required than ever. But to work, it should be more flexible and it should be integrated into the more coherent and encompassing development strategy. So I'm aware these are very short reflections, but I'll be happy to develop if there are any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Thibault. We now move on to the second part of this webinar. And this is to do with the measures that are being taken to facilitate training and examinations for the CP3 program. Next slide, please. I have not introduced myself earlier in this webinar. I have been moderating up till now. I'm a founding director of APM Group, which is a leading examination institute which accredits training for consulting organizations and manages certification schemes for various professionals worldwide. In 2014, we were awarded by the World Bank the contract to develop, manage the PPP certification program, and I'm its program director. I will speak about the impact COVID-19 has had and the things we are doing about it. The impact has been very sudden and very dramatic, as various speakers already alluded to. Most training worldwide has previously been delivered in classrooms with face-to-face contact. Due to social distancing, these have all but ceased. As a result, the number of professionals receiving certifications has collapsed. So what can we do about it? Next, please. During this time, professionals are facing lockdown and/or temporary layoff, furlough as we call it in this country, from their place of work. During this enforced period, with time on their hands, it provides a unique opportunity to enhance their skills if they wish, for when things return to normal. Qualifications will improve their job prospects and enable them to demonstrate their ability to play more constructive roles in their jobs. But how to do that if training is inaccessible? Next, please. I'm not going to go through the detail of this, but APM Group have developed an online learning platform. Most training organizations do not have online training delivery capability. Some have tried using popular conferencing programs, but these are not ideal for delivering training and do not deliver qualifications. Our bespoke online training platform, this allows trainers to deliver training and book online exams all in one application, which lead to qualifications. The application also enables trainers, because it's online, to deliver classes comprising delegates from different regions worldwide. We launched this program, or this application, last week. Over 50 training organizations have already signed up to it, and I'm pleased to say that 2 have already delivered courses last week, which will lead to qualifications for successful candidates. I'm told these went very well. Next slide, please. There is some guidance in our PPP certification guide on force majeure events, and as previous speakers have alluded to, COVID-19 represents one of these. Chapter 7 suggests that the situation is best managed by the private party, treated as an exception. There is a focus on avoiding termination by mitigation, and if necessary, getting the lenders to defer payments. Both parties, in Chapter 8, it suggests that both parties need to mitigate losses to keep the contract intact. Some contracts allow a time specified, typically 6 or 12 months, and if that is exceeded, either party may terminate the agreement. And insurance company claims should be prepared with care to maximize proceeds from the claims. That's it. Next, please. Thank you very much, Alicia. Let me now introduce Naresh Bana. He will be moderating the question and answer session, which comes next. Naresh is a veteran combat engineer and played a pivotal role in the timely completion of the Kashmir Rail project in India. He has also managed the construction and planning of a number of mega projects. His firm is engaged in PPP consulting and in various countries. Naresh is the Executive Vice Chairman of Indo-Sri Lanka Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and amongst other things, he is leading a railway project team at UNICE developing the global PPP procurement standards. I didn't mention he's also chair of Wappp editorial board. Now I'm hoping that Naresh can we move on to the next slide, please? Next slide. Right, the panel comprises the PPP experts on the panel, I should say, comprises David Baxter, Mark Freeley, Natalia Kochakova-Heeb, and Thibaut Morg. Are you there, Naresh?
Yes.
Oh,
hi,
excellent.
Michael.
Hi.
I'm there, and a very good afternoon to all of you.
Thank you. You, I believe, can see the questions.
Yes.
Certainly, there is a starter for 10 arrived by email before this session. So if you would like to read out the questions and put them to the appropriate panelist or panelists, if more than two need to answer, would you like to start doing that, please?
Yes. Yes, of course.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Once again, a very good afternoon to all the participants of the webinar. And thank you very much, Michael, for giving me this opportunity to be the co-host of this webinar. The questions, 5 of them we received from Erjon Morazze. Sorry if I am not able to pronounce it correctly. The first question is how the financial institutions will react to the COVID-19 issue. What is the readiness and how they should support the PPP scheme for the upcoming projects? And I think our able panelist, Thibaut, would be the right person to take that on. Thibaut, please. Thibaut, can you hear me?
Thibaut,
hello, Thibaut.
Huh.
Okay.
Have we lost Thibaut?
Hello. Baxter, can you hear me? David? I think
I could
they are
try
not
to
able
answer this question.
Okay.
Naresh.
Natalia is there. Natalia, carry on.
I'm there. Yeah, I mean, I would advise to go to IMF website. They made a quite a nice overview of all financial remedies available per country. Then you would see how the international financial institutions and what is the national measures available to support, let's say, networks in a time of COVID-19. Thank you.
Okay. The second question from Erzon is about the fourth measure. And this is basically the concept was one of the articles in a PPP contract. Erzon says, will this concept evolve in the right way? Who will be the most beneficiary of the public or the private part? So I think, Mark, maybe you can take that on. Mark Freeley.
Thank you for the question. Yes, force majeure, first of all, you have the general principle, which is the loss falls where it lies. But what is for sure is that most modern PPP contracts, especially concession PPP contracts, nowadays mitigate the effect of force majeure in such a way that after a certain threshold, there is a right to benefit from some mitigation related to the restoring the economic balance of the contract. And the trend now is clearer and clearer, because thanks to that trend, there will be much more projects which will have a chance to become resilient.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you very much for that insight. The third question is about the risk assessment methodology. Arjun asks how the new risk document will impact in the PPP project costs according to the future pandemic issues. Will the risk assessment increase the overall cost of the project? And our learned friend David Baxter is here. I request him to take that question.
Hi there. I think that's a really important question because, you know, understanding of risk and then the allocation of the risk is a fundamental foundation element of PPPs. You know, both parties enter into agreement. They look at the risk allocation and they share it accordingly and hopefully to the party that can best handle it. Now, I think the situation of the COVID-19, you know, often people have referred to it as a black swan event or an event that has just been so off the scale that people can't even imagine what it means. And this, I think, is going to require a considerable re-evaluation of risk and especially force majeure elements in contracts. I looked at a number of institutions, language on force majeure, trying to find a very good description of pandemic. And, you know, they're all over the place. They talk about epidemics, they talk about plague, they do talk about pandemic at certain times. But I think this is one of the clauses that has been the most underrated or most under-focused on in contracts. So we have to look at a situation that, and I think this might even require a revisiting of all the contracts that are in existence at this moment, of who is essentially going to be responsible for a force majeure COVID-19 risk. I just can't see the clauses leading to survivability, resilience, and sustainability of project that place all of the onus on the private sector, as many of these do. And, you know, there's, as Michael Dallas also pointed out, you know, well, after 6 to 12 months, you can decide to terminate. You know, that's not a good idea as well, because to terminate a PPP project, it could be another 2 to 3 years of procurement before you could relaunch it. And in that sense, critical infrastructure, if it was a healthcare one, essential transportation, water projects, and that cannot go into limbo for 2 to 3 years before you relaunch them. So we're going to have to look at what risk means, how it is defined, how it is allocated. And I think the important question is, as you also asked, Naresh, is there going to be associated cost? I think up front there will be associated cost as people re-examine this element of force majeure or risk, or however you want to define it. But as we are seeing now, we are paying a tremendous cost and a greater cost because I think of our rather naive approach to force majeure in the past. And, you know, I've heard people say, well, leave it to the lawyers, let them solve the issues. I don't think that's a good case either, because if you enter into high levels of mitigation and discussions, you know, and trying to find ways to mitigate this, and you get the lawyers involved, and I apologize to the lawyers on this call, that is going to be extremely costly, extremely time consuming, and might not result in desired outcomes where it's a win-win situation for both. So again, upfront, spend a little bit of money and do proper risk assessments. I think we have now a whole scope of new risk assessments that people are going to have to look at, and the lists that they have developed of risks, I think, are going to have to be revised, added to, and allocations are going to have to be revisited, and that's going to take time and money, but it'll be well spent and it'll be good investment for sustainable and resilient projects in the future.
Thank you, David, for such an elaborate and detailed reply. The next question is, what are some of the mechanisms for the governments to support new PP projects and or the continuing ones? And if Thibaut is back, Thibaut, hello Thibaut, can you hear me? No. So I would request Natalia to kindly take that on again. Natalia, are you there?
Yes, I'm there. I'm thinking how to answer this question. I mean, I spoke in my presentation that the government's actually looking for innovative solutions right now. So the procurement rules are loosened up in order to procure very quickly. And I think this is the time to innovate and to be proactive, to come up with unsolicited proposals. And if you have great ideas, you think it could be, you could be offering interesting solution which could be structured as a public-private partnerships. I think it's the right time to approach now the government with this idea. And I think funds are available now, and also everyone could benefit from this. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalia. Thank you very much.
Naresh, I could add something
Yeah.
if you wanted me to.
Yeah, quickly, if you can make an addition.
I think, we have two scenarios here, short term, and that's, really innovative ways, pretty much like the European Union has decided, to shorten the procurement process, etc. But I think in the long term, for projects that are in the pipeline, it's going to be critically important for governments, as some of the speakers said, to revisit their projects, decide which ones are priorities. Maybe the priorities will change. There might be a reorganizing of PPPs because there are going to be limited resources, and the private sector is weakened, the public sector is weakened. They need to strengthen one another, and they'll only be strengthening one another if they launch projects that are, I think, people first focused and offer value for money.
Thank you, David. And we come to the fifth question of Arjun Muratraj, which is about the dispute contracts. How the COVID-19 issues in the PPP contracts will be held in courts. And we have no better person than Mark. Mark, can we have the answer, please?
Sure. First of all, I don't think that there will be many disputes going to court for PPP contracts. It's very simply because a project cannot stop and it cannot fail. So in my view, in most cases, there will be a new approach for renegotiation with simple criteria. And those simple criteria for negotiation with references on the economic and on the viability of the project becomes, when it is put in the right manner with good indicator, become quite simple to put on the table and to reach an agreement. The second point, I think, is that it is essential in all future PPP contracts, as it exists already in many of them, to have a scale for avoiding disputes, starting by what is called currently now the partnering approach, where on a regular basis, all the people are around the table, and we typically the case for the COVID, all around the table, put everything on the table, clear, transparent, and thinks at what all the stakeholders, like that was said before by David, will be impacted. By doing so, you arrive very often to a solution. Now, next one will be more and more advisable in the large projects is to have dispute avoidance boards, which are currently promoted, for instance, by the World Bank and others, to avoid dispute, a standing board of people who are there as from the beginning of the project, independent and high level, looking at the project on a regular basis, again, looking at the project, discussing with everyone before going to court. Now, the last one will be arbitration. I don't think that PPP project, most of them could really be well handled by local court, simply because there are very little precedents, and local court will take years in order to find a solution. But arbitration is different. If the arbitration clause is good, with a good arbitration institution, and also with a good reference to a set of laws and a procedure, then eventually the arbitration are very likely to consider that COVID certain excuse as force majeure, but in many situations also looking at what we call lex mercatoria, which is the equity as it is promoted by Judith Reuters internationally.
Thank you, Mark. Now, before I go to the next question, my request to the honorable panelists is that while you are keen on giving a very detailed and comprehensive response because of the time, I would request you to keep it little more brief and more concise, because we have total 40 questions today and we have been able to do only 5 till now. So as I go on the next question, do we have scenarios? It is asked by Mr. or Mrs. Matembu, and the question is, do we have scenarios with COVID-19 durations, typically 1 to 3, 1, 3 or 5 year scenarios, and what are the implications? And I request David Baxter to kindly respond to that.
Thank you. I'll keep it simply. I think, we've got to look at 3 sort of time frames: the short term, the medium term, and the long term. I think the short term are the sort of the rescue and keeping PPPs operating scenario, where everything is done, where we sit down and we look at, ways of avoiding disputes, sitting down in round tables and addressing the projects. I think what's really important in the short term is also that we come up with solutions that are forward looking or forward future projected, so that when we get to the medium phase and then the long term phase, that we can address in the medium phase. I see that as maybe 1 to 2 years after this event, where the focus has been on the survivability of existing projects, rescuing them, and also building up a whole category of lessons learned. And I think what's important also is for countries to look at the enabling environments, their legal frameworks, to make changes where it is possible. And then in the third term, sort of the long term, up to maybe 5 years and beyond, I think we have to now explore PPPs that are going to be very focused on commercial and economic viability from a new perspective of what happens if there is no users, for example. It's going to vary between the different types of projects. But I think, again, the whole element here and the refocus is going to be scenarios on projects that are sustainable and resilient. And I think it's really important that governments look at their PPP projects that they have in their pipeline at present. And if there are PPP projects that are sort of wishful thinking ones, white elephant type projects, scrap them and focus the international finance resources, the public sector and private sector resources on projects that are going to offer value for money, value for people, etc.
Thank you, David. Now let's move to the next question. It is from Setu Narayanan, and he's asking, what will be the impact on potential or new PPP investments? Will the second P in the PPP, that is the private sector, cut back participation? And we have no one best than Natalia to answer that. Natalia, please.
Actually, I don't think I'm the right person. I think Tibor is a banker in our community.
Unfortunately, he has left.
I think I should readdress this to him. I don't want to steal bread from him.
You are back, then you take it on. Please come in.
Thank you, Naresh. Sorry, Natalia.
Yeah, come in.
Yeah, I think basically investors will take a strong criteria assessment to evaluate the viability of the project because there is more uncertainty. In that case, they will probably be more risk averse. That means that projects will need to be better prepared with more security packages and limiting the economic risk, especially for sectors that will be particularly exposed to the downturn, such as primarily everybody thinks of air transport, of course, but there are other sectors as well, for instance, tourism. So that being said, there is a need to all partners to sit around the table and to find innovative financing structures, for instance, through blended finance with international institutions being more heavily involved in the financial instruments that are put to the disposal of the projects. But it's true that a number of projects that were considered viable up to now will have to be reconsidered. So there will be a need to reassess the pipeline and prioritize those which have the best chances for implementation.
Thank you, Tebo. And that was a very nice reply after a little break, possibly in your communications. We move on to the next question from Neil, and he's asking, there are very many global multi-stakeholder platforms that my association is a member of, but I am not sure any of them are proving that useful in galvanizing the public and private sector and others around COVID-19. With that, he's asking, are there any global or UN type partnerships that the panelists or guests recommend? And I would request Mark to kindly enlighten with his knowledge about such organizations.
Thank you. Yes, what I can mention is what UNICE is currently working on for now several years. And the objective of UNICE is clearly to promote PPP, which are resilient and sustainable. And as such, they have developed the concept of people first PPP. And in order to give meat to the concept, develop the concept, then there have been a lot of analysis and report which has been put to the UNICE that UNICE has reviewed and UNICE has promoted. So there is a permanent discussion within UNICE on PPP, especially for developing sustainable projects in a low and middle income country. The website is quite detailed, quite clear, and there are regular meetings twice a year at least on topics which are of interest to most countries.
Thank you, Mark. We move
I would
on
like to add. May I add
okay,
something?
Natalia, please. Natalia?
Well, I would mention, for instance, there is an initiative from World Economic Forum, and they actually, what they are doing, they are mapping the initiatives, how the private sector is contributing to combating COVID-19, and there are some very good examples of this, so I would recommend to check this. Also, I mentioned in my presentation PPP Health for All. It's also meant to be multi-stakeholder platform that will be promoting the PPPs in healthcare, and of course looking very particular at the COVID-19. We just launched the risk assessment for citizens to check the risk of COVID infection. You could also have a look.
Thank you, Natalia. Now the next question is from our friend Ahmed Mateen Zahid, and he's asking, how can businesses most effectively help the millions living below the poverty line who are particularly suffering from the economic crisis caused by COVID-19? And may I request David Baxter to briefly answer that?
Thank you. I think there's, a wide variety of understandings of public-private partnerships. Some of them are really partnerships between the public and the private sector, which are philanthropic in nature, right through to the highly structured public-private partnerships, which we are talking about here. I think, in one way, if we look at just from the philanthropy viewpoint, they can offer partnerships between corporations and governments or institutions that can fill the gaps as the forces rally themselves for a more concerted effort. I think, with businesses helping, it's specifically, I think, going to be in food security as well as in healthcare. We see the situation in the United States now where factories are closing down for meat production. They think that even by the end of this coming month, or that's only a week away or a few days away, that there are going to be drastic food shortages, which is just disastrous for those who are at risk. So, you know, finding ways in partnerships that improve, you know, production, maybe even using technology like apps between different suppliers and users, that they have resources available, come and get it instead of just plowing it into the ground as it's happening in many places in the United States. And then obviously the healthcare is going to be incredibly important in countries where the public sector and the private sector collaborate more closely to provide healthcare facilities to those who are poor, because it's an economic crisis for them as much as it is as a healthcare crisis. And if they can't afford medical care, there's going to be an impact. And if they can't work, there's going to be an impact. And I think this is particularly important in countries which don't have national healthcare systems like the United States, where healthcare is largely privatized. I think the public and private sector are going to have to work closer together to see how they can address where.
Thank you, David. Now, friends, I'm going to skip certain questions where the same participant has asked more than one question, so that we have wider answer to the wider audience. And for the next question, I take you to Hossein Norzad, who's asking, what are the lessons learned for future in terms of designing flexible contracts? And I request Mark to kindly take that on.
Thank you. Yes, in fact, many lessons have already been learned for designing a flexible contract. They have been learned for the kind of PPP project which were the more complex and the more risky, which are a concession PPP where it is a situation where the private sector recovers from users' fees. And then you have many risks, such as demand risk, etc., etc. It was obvious that if you just put something very a wall between each party, then you have hardly no chance to have a resilient concession PPP with demand risk. So then, for years and years, there has been exchanges, and nowadays we are arriving to a situation which has been, by the way, well developed by UNICE, a situation where there are a new set of best practices which can be promoted, which derive from all the negotiation on those issues, from all the case study on those issues, which in the past have been essentially developed in a civil law world in France, in Italy, in Spain, or in Latin America, where you have currently 2,500 concession PPP working. So from there, from that bulk of experience, there are new standards which can be put in the contract, and you may very quickly have a reference to this list of clauses and guiding principle for concession PPP contract, which has been recently published by UNICE, which give many answers to this particular point.
Okay, thank you, Mark. And the next question we take from Licia Saner, and the question is to Michael. When moving on to an online training platform for qualification training, how do you ensure consistency of quality and learning outcome? Michael, please.
We have a network of accredited training organizations who have to go through various tests to ensure that they train in the correct, using the correct material, and that all their trainers are competent to deliver that message to the participants. One of the criteria for the trainers is that they have 5 years of direct experience with PPPs, for example. So the consistency is assured by the fact that the trainers use the same material provided by and approved by APM Group. And then the exams, again, are set. We do not do the training organizations do that. The exams are centrally set by APM Group and marked in a consistent manner so that the qualification is the same whether you take it on this side of the planet or the other side.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Michael, for such a concise response. The next question is from Alina Sanaka, and she's asking, given the fact that the pandemics exposed weaknesses of many public services, as a result of which sector, that is in addition to health, would benefit most from using PPPs? And I request David Baxter to please address that.
That's a very interesting question. I think, it's going to be determined by country-specific needs that are focused on their sustainable development goals. So, if it's going to be, for example, a big focus on development of education, I think that's going to be one area. And my wife is an educator here, and she's not been able to see her students for over 6 weeks in the United States because of the shutdown. So I would think just, an example of that is finding innovative technology, innovative approaches of collaboration between the tech providers and the education ministries, departments, whatever they are called, to find a way that they can be innovative, collaborative, leverage both resources. And one of the speakers before, I can't remember who it was, said, to shorten the procurement process, maybe it's really a good idea for governments at this time to focus on a pool of qualified bidders. I think this is something that can also be done to, to get so if it was in the education field, there are education platform providers, pre-qualify them so that there's a reference point where departments of education all over the country or all over the world can go to and say, these are pre-qualified companies that we can work with. So I think education is going to be really important. I also think, agricultural outreach programs for food security, as I said, are important. And then we can't allow, water supply and sanitation to suffer either, because that will just increase the pandemic's expense. Maybe some of the transportation projects will take a bit of a back step now in the priorities, but I think it's based on countries' priorities, what their sustainable development goals are, whether they are viable, where they are needed, whether they're affordable. And also, I think maybe we will have a little bit of a movement away from mega projects to medium-sized projects.
Thank you, David. And the next question is from Johans. And the system is telling me he has left, but the question is to Mark, and it is interesting. The question is, what advice would you give to governments, especially in the developing markets, who may face serious fiscal limitations to explore carte blanche PPPs? How can they use this COVID-19 experience to better identify, plan, and prepare PPP projects given the limited fiscal space as a result of the economic crisis? Mark.
Well, this is a real important question because we all know that in low and middle income countries, the fiscal crisis will limit drastically the possibility for the government either to enter into traditional contracts such as design and build, or to enter into contract or PPP contract, which are public payment PPP. So then there is a need to explore further how much it is possible to have more contracts where actually there is a possibility to get users' fees and up to which limit. And there is a lot of developments which are very promising if you look at the international scene, since of course users' fee creates some problems, but the question is the possibility nowadays with several techniques of various kind to limit the risk and to apportion much better the risk. And I think COVID would be a very good example of the kind of situation where there is a risk which one unforeseen. This is the case in most PPP contracts lasting for 30 years or 40 years. We already all know that we're entering into a contract where we don't know a few things. So then the future, in our view, is to go into PPP contracts which are real partnership. Both parties have a common goal, and then they adjust their goal, they adjust their obligation within the contract while keeping the goal. And they do that like in a company, they have a board. And this is something for which there is sufficient experience around the world to put that more globally for the interests of the stakeholders. And I think there is a lot of future in that direction after having developed that in several countries.
Thank you, Mark. And Michael, do we have sufficient time from your end to take one more question?
Big pardon, I was on mute. Yeah, just one more question. Then I think we need to wrap it up because we're coming close. It needs to be a quick question.
Okay. The question is from Sayaduddin, and it says that, do you see less appetite for emerging markets from both investors and lenders? Do you foresee this to be longer term impact? Will investors wait to see macroeconomic impact and government approach to handling these shocks prior to committing an emerging market? My friend Thibu, are you there? Thibu, okay, Thibu has left. So I would request David Baxter to quickly, because we are running short of time, please answer this.
Yes, I think there is going to be a greater need and greater opportunities, but for projects that are well structured, well thought out. And this is going to be a challenge for governments as they want to continue with PPP projects, because they're going to have to do an outreach to the market. They're going to have to do market sounding, determine what projects are of interest, and then countries will go for it. And I think what is critically important is how governments handle the situation now is going to determine how people in the private sector are going to react about partnerships next year.
Thank you, David. That was a very interesting answer session, and I hand over to Michael for the rest of the winding up of webinar. Thank you.
Thank you. I was going to suggest that since there are a number of questions that are unanswered, that we circulate the unanswered questions to the panelists and request that they give a brief answer or just to close that loop. This will have to happen outside of the webinar. Alicia, would that be possible? You there, Alicia?
Yes, that's absolutely fine. Yes, we can get those questions out to everybody. And of course, we can also get this presentation, a copy of the slides and the recording. We will send a link to everybody that's registered as well.
Yeah, just a shame to leave so many questions unanswered, that's all. Okay, if you could give us the next slide then, Alicia, please. This is just a slide to illustrate how and why APM Group have collaborated with WAPPP and vice versa. Essentially, the CP3P qualification provides a ladder for PPP professionals to attain a certified PPP professional qualification through 3 different qualifications: foundation, preparation, and execution. And then they can play a useful part in PPP units, which the WAPPP provides a network with other PPP units, and a means of addressing PPP opportunities around the world. I think we need to stop there. If we can move on to the next slide, please. The final slide. Thank you all for your cooperation and staying to the bitter end. Most of you, I notice, I do have a count of how many people are attending this webinar, and it has not dropped off that much. So I'm very pleased that you have been patient. If you need to contact either Wappp or APM Group, that's the two addresses. If you need to contact any of these speakers, their addresses are on their introduction slide. So thank you everyone, particularly the panelists for both presenting and answering the questions so capably, and for everyone else showing the interest and listening in. I hope you have gained useful information and will join us on our next webinar, which will happen in a month or two's time. Thank you and goodbye.